there's your notice that you have to agree to the recording. This event is co-sponsored by the Chair in Transgender Studies and Kolat Mayim Reform Temple. It's a part of Kolat Mayim's 6-part series of talks on the theme of building bridges, celebrating diversity in Jewish life. The stellar list of speakers includes Indigenous, Black, Asian, feminist, gender and sexually diverse, and differently abled advocates whose vision, wisdom, and activism serves to make our world a better place. Kolat Mayim, meaning Voices of the Water, is Victoria's Reformed Jewish congregation, founded in 1998. Kolat Mayim is a diverse congregation made up of individuals of all ages, from secular, religious, Ashkenazi, and Sephardic backgrounds, including interfaith couples, LGBTQ+ people, and members with varying abilities. Dedicated to Jewish continuity, Kolat Mayim has a strong focus on learning about, practicing, and celebrating Jewish life. Co-sponsored by the Chair in Transgender Studies, the chair is the world's first chair in transgender studies, and we work to provide inspiration and hope to trans plus people and our allies everywhere. We contribute to the development and the communication of accurate, research-based, real-world knowledge about trans plus people that can be used to build better policies and laws and to drive social change. We also help to build strong and resilient trans plus social and cultural communities and individual well-being by facilitating arts, cultural, and social activities. And in all that we do, we are committed to applying an intersectional lens in our work to advance reconciliation, racial justice, equity, and inclusion for all. In addition to our ongoing public lectures series, such as today's talk, we offer many other services and activities, including the world's largest transgender archives, interdisciplinary and international biennial Moving Trans History Forward conferences, scholarships for UVic students, fellowships for visitors, and arts and cultural events. So please look for us on the web. We have several websites and we're active in social media. So after all of that lengthy introduction, let me introduce you to Joy Ladin. The title of Joy's talk is Jonah, God and Other Strangers, Reading the Torah from a Trans Perspective. Joy Ladin is the first openly transgender professor at an Orthodox Jewish institution. She holds a PhD in American literature from Princeton University and long held the Gottsman Chair in English at Yeshiva University. She serves as an emeritus member of the Board of Keshet, an organization devoted to full inclusion of LGBTQ+ Jews in the Jewish world. And from my personal experience, she is an all-around lovely human being. Her recent book, The Soul of the Stranger, Reading God and Torah from a Transgender Perspective, was a Lambda Literary Award and a Triangle Award finalist. The Book of Anna, won the 2021 Beru Poetry Award from the National Jewish Book Awards, and in 2022, Joy Ladin was awarded a Massachusetts Cultural Council Artist Fellowship. Watch for her new book of poems, forthcoming very soon, Shekhinah Speaks, which is in the voice of the Shekhinah, the feminine aspect of the divine. In this talk, Joy will share her personal journey and offer her insights and unique reading of gender identity in the Hebrew Torah. Welcome, Joy.
Thank you so much, Aaron, and thank you to everyone who made this possible. I'm delighted to be here virtually with all of you. I'm going to read for a while, and then Aaron and I will have a brief dialogue, and then we will open it up to comments and questions. I'm often asked how I reconcile being religious with being transgender. For me, there's never been a conflict between them. As long as I can remember, I felt that I was female. And as long as I can remember, I've sensed God's presence. I've gotten used to talking about being transgender, but no matter how much I talk about my relationship with God, it still makes me squirm to say I feel God's presence. I grew up surrounded by people for whom God is God, an empty word or an outdated superstition, a symbol of ideals that human beings find it hard to live up to. Even at Hebrew school and synagogue, I didn't dare let anyone guess that to me, God wasn't an abstraction, but someone who was there, invisible, but as real as cold or warmth or humidity. No one else I knew seemed to experience God as a living presence. But when I read the Torah, the Hebrew Bible, that was the God I found there. The Torah portrays God as passionately involved with human lives, not just with extraordinary individuals like Abraham and Sarah, but with everyone. God doesn't buy or sell, but insists that we do so honestly. God doesn't have parents, but is concerned about how we treat ours. God doesn't live in space or time, but wants us to give meaning to the seasons and places of our lives. But the Torah also makes it clear that though God is present in human lives, God is not human. God has no face, no form, no beginning or end, and can't be understood in any of the terms we use to understand ourselves and our world. As God tells Moses at the burning bush, God is what God is and will be whatever God will be. This invisible, incomprehensible, but undeniably present God is the God I grew up with, not because my family was religious, they weren't, not because we read Torah together, we certainly didn't, not even because religious teachers or rabbis taught me to think about God this way. Unfortunately, no one taught me to think about God at all. It's because, as long as I can remember, this was the God to whom I woke and with whom I fell asleep, the God to whom I whispered and whimpered, pleaded, and sometimes screamed. To me, God wasn't a mystical experience. God was a fact of life, like my parents. But I felt closer to God than to my parents. My parents, like other human beings, identified me with my male body. To them, I was a boy named Jay, and both because I loved them and because I was terrified of being rejected if they guessed the truth, I did my best to act like the boy they thought I was. God never mistook me for the body others saw. God knew who I truly was and how alone I felt, because God, like me, had no body to make God visible, no face human beings could see. To God, I suspect I didn't seem so different from the kids I grew up with. Like other children, I ate and slept and went to school, rode my bike, played, was self-centered and sometimes cruel, careless of the truth and others' feelings. But even though in most ways I was like other children, I always felt I was something else, something that had no name or place in the world. Nowadays, I'd say that because I didn't fit into the gender binary that defines everyone as either male or female, I couldn't feel that I was really part of humanity. But when I was a kid, all I knew was that my sense of being female made me different in ways that were shameful and dangerous, ways that kept others from seeing or understanding or loving me. Of course, none of us are exactly who we seem to be. Few people old enough to think about it would say that their bodies perfectly express who they are, although I've spoken to a couple of undergraduates who assure me that their bodies do express who they are, and not surprisingly, they're fabulously attractive. Um, but most of us feel like there's at least a little slippage between our bodies and that other people see and who we know ourselves to be. Um, Gender and other identities are always compromises that require us to sacrifice some of our messy individuality in order to fit into our families, friendships, and communities. When it came to gender, I wasn't able to make that compromise. I could and did act like the boy I was supposed to be, but I couldn't feel that I really was that boy. Couldn't feel that I really was present in any relationship, because every relationship was based on gender. I wasn't just my parents' child. I was supposed to be their son. I wasn't just a kid on the block. I was supposed to be one of the boys. I wasn't even just a Jew. I was supposed to be a Jewish male. And so, even though I was surrounded by people who saw me as one of them, I grew up feeling invisible, alone, and afraid. But I was alone with God. All the things that cut me off from other people, my lack of a body that felt like mine, my inability to fit into gender categories, my sense of being unspeakably different, made me feel closer to God. God knew who and what I was. God had made me, fitting my mismatched body and soul together. God was always there, day and night, as I tried to live and sometimes tried to die. We were an odd couple, me struggling with a body that didn't feel like mine, God existing beyond all that is, was, or will be. But when it came to relating to human beings, God and I had something in common. Neither of us could be seen or understood by those we dwelt among and loved. And so, as long as I can remember, being transgender has brought me closer to God. That may sound strange. Both religious and non-religious people tend to think of trans and non-binary identities as inherently secular. But most religious traditions recognize that conditions that cut us off from other people can bring us closer to God. And there are many people whose relations with God have been profoundly shaped by being transgender or non-binary, because as they wrestled with suffering, isolation, and questions about who they were and how they should live, they, like other religious people, turned to God for the understanding they couldn't find among human beings. There's a lot more awareness of trans and non-binary people today than when I was growing up. Something like this was unimaginable in the 60s or 70s. And there are many more religious communities that accept us. But even the most welcoming communities have just begun to consider how religious traditions, based on the assumption that human beings are either and always male or female, can speak to people who don't fit those categories. I was in my mid-40s before I knew any rabbis who would accept me as a transgender Jew. But I heard Jewish tradition speak to me every Yom Kippur afternoon, when Jews traditionally read the book of Jonah, which tells a story every trans person knows. The story of someone desperate to avoid living as the person, in Jonah's case, as the prophet, they know themselves to be. From the beginning of the book, when God orders him to go at once to Nineveh and proclaim judgment upon it, it's clear that Jonah knows he's a prophet. Jonah doesn't ask why God chose him to deliver this message, or argue, as Moses does at the burning bush, that he isn't qualified to do it. He just runs away, because, as he explains in the final chapter, he knows God won't destroy Nineveh, no matter how wicked the people are. Even as God tells him of God's impending judgment, Jonah, as befits a prophet, already knows God will spare them. Jonah is so desperate to avoid being a prophet that he abandons whatever life he's been living and boards a ship to Tarshish, which, when I was a kid, I imagined being something like Buffalo. Buffalo is Rochester, New York, but worse. And Tarshish must have been like where Jonah was, but somehow unspeakably worse. But as many trans people know, when we flee from being who we are, we flee from life itself. While his ship is tossed by a God-sent storm, Jonah stays asleep in the hold, in a slumber so deep it overrides even his instinct for self-preservation. When the captain wakes him and tells him to call upon your God for deliverance, Jonah responds not with prayer, but with a suicidal gesture, telling the sailors, "Heave me overboard, and the sea will calm down for you." Why would Jonah respond this way? After all, he knows that God sent the storm because he refused to go to Nineveh. So he could have appeased God's anger by telling God he'd do what God ordered him to do. Jonah's self-destructive response reflects a psychological pattern all too familiar among trans people. Flee from yourself as long as you can, and when you can no longer endure the internal and external storms, kill yourself for the sake of others, so you can avoid ever having to live as who you are. Jonah is so desperate to avoid living as the prophet he is that he prefers not to live at all. Trans people often tell ourselves suicide will resolve the conflict between our need to be and not be who we really are. Our families, our communities, our world will be better off without us, we think. And we, released from the shame of hiding and the terror of living our truths, will finally be at peace. In Jonah's case, this suicidal fantasy seems to come true. When he's thrown overboard, the sea stops raging and he sinks peacefully into the depths, into the heart of the sea, where he's famously swallowed by a whale. But Jonah, miraculously, doesn't die. In the depths of the sea, in the belly of the whale, he finds himself alone with the God he fled. God literally surrounds him, providing him with breath, warmth, protection, sustaining his life in the midst of death. In other words, Jonah's flight from himself leads him simultaneously closer to death and closer to God. That spiritual paradox is at the heart of his story, and it was at the heart of the story of my life when I was living as a man I knew I wasn't. Like Jonah, I was so desperate to avoid living as who I was that I eagerly chose death over life, despair over hope, isolation over human connection. Even in the midst of my family, I felt like I was alone at the bottom of the sea. But I wasn't alone. Though suicidal depression swallowed me for decades, God was there, surrounding me, holding me, keeping me alive. For Jonah, his miraculous deliverance is a turning point. He's so grateful that God has spared him that when the whale vomits him out on shore, which must not have been pleasant, he overcomes his reluctance to present himself as a prophet, and without even showering, he heads to Nineveh. Unlike Jonah, I experienced God as preserving me in the depths rather than delivering me to life. God didn't want me to live as who I really was, I told myself. God wanted me. God was helping me submerge my true self forever. That's what love is, I told myself. Pretending to be what others want you to be, suffering in silence, embracing loneliness, giving up on joy. Year after year, when the ram's horn blew on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, I wept, not because I was repenting of my sins, but because I knew that as long as I lived as a man, I'd never feel truly alive. God could preserve my life in the depths of suicidal despair, but even God couldn't deliver me from those depths unless I did what Jonah did, except that I had to live as who I really was. Despite his gratitude for God's deliverance, Jonah still isn't thrilled about being a prophet, which in his case means walking through Nineveh proclaiming, 40 days more and Nineveh shall be overthrown. As Jonah no doubt knew, prophets often paid a heavy price for expressing God's displeasure with the social order. Jeremiah is thrown into a pit. 400 of Elijah's fellow prophets were murdered. Jonah isn't imprisoned or killed, but his work as a prophet requires him to disrupt the community and challenge social norms by acting in ways that mark him as different. Like Jonah, I knew I couldn't live as who I was without being stared at, treated as an embarrassment or public menace, and risking the ridicule and violence trans people face every day. It was easy to imagine how I and those I loved might suffer if I dared express my female gender identity. But what good, I wondered, could possibly come of living a truth that would mark me, publicly and permanently, as other? That's Jonah's question too. Despite firsthand knowledge of God's plans, Jonah never does understand what good comes of him living as a prophet, since, as he says at the end of the book, he always knew that God would be merciful whether he marched through Nineveh or not. But unlike Jonah, the people of Nineveh couldn't hear God summoning them to change their lives. They needed to hear that message from a human throat, from a body they could see, from a person who not only saw things differently, but was willing to stand up and stand out as different. Jonah saved Nineveh, or rather, he enabled Nineveh to save itself by accepting the discomfort and the risk of being the prophet he was. Most trans and non-binary people aren't visionaries or prophets, and someday those will be no harder to understand than any other ways of being human. When that day comes, we won't have to wonder if we should kill ourselves or pretend to be other than who we are. We'll face our human share of sorrow and struggle, And when we look to religious community for help, we'll know that the traditions that sustain, comfort, and guide others are there to sustain, comfort, and guide us too. But for most of us, that future is still a distant dream. And so trans people daily face the kinds of choices Jonah faced. Will we run away, sink into despair, throw ourselves into the sea? Or will we live as who we are, even when that means being seen as different, disruptive, a threat to social order? I don't mean to suggest that the book of Jonah is about being transgender, although that would be really cool. But the book of Jonah is about being human, and transgender experience is human experience. The questions trans and non-binary people face are questions that face us all. Everyone has to decide when we can't and when we must sacrifice our individuality for the sake of families and communities, when we have to be what others count on us to be, and when, like Jonah, we have to live the truths that set us apart. When we read the book of Jonah in the light of trans and non-binary experience, we're reminded that the crisis it dramatizes is one that most people face sooner or later. The crisis of realizing that we must live what makes us different, or we can't live at all. Jewish communities have only recently recognized the existence of trans and non-binary Jews. And recently, in Jewish time, we're talking 3,000 years here, so it's going to be recent for a while. But in Jewish tradition, the need to include those who don't fit the usual human roles and categories goes back to the beginning of the Ten Commandments, when God insists that the Israelites accept that God is unlike anything they know. God says, "You shall have no other gods besides me. You shall not make for yourself a sculptured image or any likeness of what is in the heavens above or on the earth below or in the waters under the earth." This is not only a prohibition against idolatry, it's also a declaration that the foundation of Judaism is recognition of God's difference, not just from other Iron Age deities, but from everything human beings can see, experience, and understand. God's voice emerges not from a throat, but from thunder and flame. God's presence shakes the mountain. If we treat God as a deity we can understand, we're repeating our own version of the making of the golden calf. If we don't recognize God's incomprehensible difference, we aren't recognizing God. When I was a child, I thought God, like me, despaired of finding a place in human community because we were both too different to fit fundamental roles and categories. But even in the midst of the genocidal rages that lead God to consider wiping out the Israelites after they make the golden calf and refuse to occupy Canaan, God never stops believing that we, can make a place for a being who doesn't fit the roles and categories that are the basis for communal relationships. And God is right. Shocker, I know. But God is right. Human communities can include individuals who are too different to fit in. Social scientists call people in that position hyperminorities. W.E.B. Du Bois, the great African-American sociologist and activist, used a simpler term, saying that his own position as a Harvard-educated African-American with a PhD at the turn of the 20th century made him a problem. "Between me and the other world," he wrote, "there's ever an unasked question, unasked by some through feelings of delicacy, by others through the difficulty of rightly framing it. All, nevertheless, flutter round it. They approach me in a half-hesitant sort of way, eye me curiously or compassionately, and then, instead of saying directly, 'How does it feel to be a problem?' they say, 'I know an excellent colored man in my town,' or 'I fought at Mechanicsville,' or 'Do not these Southern outrages make your blood boil?' At these I smile, or am interested, or reduce the boiling to a simmer, as the occasion may require. To the real question, 'How does it feel to be a problem?' I answer seldom a word." Like God among the Israelites, Du Bois is not only different from the people who surround him, he's different in ways that make it impossible for them to understand him, because he doesn't fit the roles and categories assigned to people of color by the brutal early 20th century version of America's racial binary. His difference, impossible for white people to ignore and impossible for them to comprehend, makes Du Bois, to them, a problem. Now that I live as myself, I often feel like a problem. I live in communities where I'm the only one who's different in the way I'm different, the only person who doesn't fit or make sense in what Du Bois would call the other world of binary gender. Like Du Bois among white Northerners, I have a place in that other world, or rather, I have places in a few of the communities that are part of the world of binary gender. And I don't hide my difference. It's public knowledge that I'm trans. But if others say nothing about it, I say nothing. If someone says they know an excellent transgender person, which happens from time to time, I smile. If they tell me that they support LGBTQ rights, I show interest and encouragement. If they express anger at the mistreatment of LGBTQ people, I, like Du Bois, try to reduce the boiling to a simmer. No one ever asks, and I never say, how it feels to be a problem. This is not a comfortable position to be in. But for me, it's better to be seen as a problem by a community that makes a place, however awkward, for my difference, than to believe, as I did for most of my life, that I had to choose between concealing who I am or being exiled forever. A devastating choice that many trans and non-binary people continue to face. God's persistence in dwelling among the Israelites suggests that God makes a similar decision. God prefers to be seen as a problem, to be recognized as a being the Israelites can't understand, than not to be seen at all. And as far as God and the Torah are concerned, God is a problem that's easily solved. Everyone should always accommodate God, no matter how strange or burdensome God's demands may seem. This approach also works really well with trans people. If you just do what we ask, we won't give you any trouble. But as the frequent conflicts between God and the Israelites in the book of Numbers shows, it can be hard for communities to accommodate hyperminorities, and easy for hyperminorities to feel rejected when they don't. By definition, hyperminorities are different in ways others don't understand, and so our feelings and needs can be difficult to anticipate, and the accommodations we require may not seem to make sense. We see those difficulties in God's responses to the Israelites' complaints about their God-given diet of manna, which they eat for every meal, day after day, year after year, for 40 years. It's not surprising that the Israelites would get tired of this monotonous diet. The Torah rather proudly tells us that no matter how it was prepared, it tasted like rich cream. And nothing is more human than complaining about the food. But to God, the Israelites' desire for a varied diet seems like rejection, and the gratitude for it God expects feels to the Israelites like an unreasonable demand that they upend their most basic tastes and habits. Like most people, I live on both sides of this situation. In some communities, I'm the misunderstood minority who's seen as a problem. In others, I'm part of the majority that doesn't understand the feelings of those who are different. At my university, I was both at once. In the majority, as a relatively able-bodied white person of Ashkenazi descent, and as an openly trans person, the only one of my kind. To the extent that God's difficulties among the Israelites reflect God's position as a hyperminority, this means that most of us, I would guess all of us, have something in common with God. Whether we're the only openly non-binary person in a given organization, the only Black Jew in an otherwise white synagogue, the only white person living in a Black community, the only blind person at a school where everyone else can see, no matter who or what we are, we each may find ourselves in the position of being problematic hyperminorities in some communities, no matter how well we fit into others. At one time or another, most of us will feel invisible and incomprehensible to those we live with and love. and be wounded by words and actions which, to most of the community, are just routine. In the commandment not to oppress the stranger, God summons us to recognize this invisible kinship between those who are most marginalized and those who are most central to communities. To see that no matter how different others seem, the experience of being seen as different is something we all have in common. God says, it's in a number of different versions, over and over again, you shall not oppress a stranger, for you know the soul of the stranger, having yourselves been strangers in the land of Egypt. This commandment combines hard-headed realism, the acknowledgement that even Israelites who were oppressed as strangers in the land of Egypt are likely to turn around and oppress others when they have a chance, with the idealistic belief that people who enjoy the privilege and power of being us can and will identify with those they see as them. I've thrilled to those words since I first read them as a child, but I never believed anyone would live up to them. My skepticism was reinforced every time my family saw a man they considered queer. We didn't respond as the commandment imagines, by affirming that because Jews had been seen as strangers in the land of Egypt, we knew the soul of the queer. Instead, our stares, facial expressions, and mutterings made it clear that we didn't want to understand such a man. Of course, the commandment not to oppress the stranger doesn't order gender normative Israelites to identify with the experience of not fitting gender norms. It commands them to identify with an experience, being oppressed as strangers in Egypt, that all of them could remember when the commandment was first given. But the commandment is not only directed at those who've been enslaved, it also speaks to those born free in the wilderness and to the generations after, who've never been seen as strangers in their own land. In fact, even the Israelites who had been enslaved don't seem to remember being strangers in the land of Egypt. When they remember life in Egypt, as they do when complaining about manna, they remember it fondly, like exiles who long to return. Their nostalgia suggests that even though they were enslaved for being different, they saw Egypt as home. And that, the experience of being treated as strangers in the society they felt to be their own, is what God orders the Israelites to recall in the commandment not to oppress the stranger. That's what ger, the Hebrew word translated as stranger in this commandment, means. Not a foreigner with no permanent ties to Israelite society, but what US immigration law calls a resident alien, and the Torah refers to as the stranger who dwells among you, a person who lives in the Israelite community, but is always seen as different. Later Jewish tradition saw two different kinds of gerim, the ger toshav, who lives with you and observes some commandments, but doesn't become Jewish, and the ger tzedek, or righteous stranger, who identifies as a Jew and formally converts to Judaism. Judaism requires those who convert to Judaism be seen as Jews and tries to protect them from discrimination by, for example, forbidding Jews to refer to the fact that a ger tzedek wasn't born Jewish. But as the term ger tzedek shows, no matter how strongly they identify as Jews, no matter how fully they embrace Judaism and Jewishness, the rabbis assume that Jews who convert will always be seen as gerim, as strangers. In fact, the Hebrew word for converting is lahitgayer, which literally means to make yourself a stranger. To become a Jew is to identify yourself with a community in which you will always be seen as a stranger. And that's not the only way that people hitgayer. Immigrants make strangers of themselves when they take new homes in communities where their accents or mores will always mark them as different. And I made a stranger of myself when I stopped living as a man and started living as a woman. People who'd always greeted me on the street or at synagogue walked by without a sign of recognition. They weren't trying to slight me. They'd known me as a man. As a woman, I was a stranger. But ger and lahitgayer don't refer to the kind of sudden estrangement I experienced as a result of gender transition. They refer to the long-term situation of living in a community in which, no matter how long or how well known we are, We're always seen as too different to fit in. After the shock of transition wears off, that's the position that many openly trans and non-binary people find ourselves in. And that's the position rabbis expect Jews who convert to face in Jewish communities. The price of living as who we truly are is that we're seen as gerim, as strangers. Maybe we're admired for our courage, but we're seen as strangers nonetheless. The Torah makes it clear that gerim are built into God's idea of Jewish community and religion. In fact, even while the Jews are walking out of Egypt, God commands that when they celebrate the Passover in the future, they have to make sure to make a place for the gerim to celebrate Passover, which has got to be the absolute last thing on the minds of the people who are leaving Egypt in the middle of the night. But for God, this is top of mind. To God, making a place for the stranger, even at the ritual that defines and celebrates Israelite identity, is so important that this is among the first commandments God gives after they begin to leave Egypt. But in the commandment not to oppress the stranger, God goes beyond ordering the Israelites to make a place for gerim. Though God doesn't use the term, the commandment requires every Israelite to hit gayer, to identify as strangers, both collectively, as members of a people who are treated as strangers, and individually, by knowing and acknowledging that we know the soul, the experience of being seen as strangers in our own communities. When I was growing up, I was sure God and I were the only strangers in a world of human beings who fit gender and other defining roles and categories perfectly. I now know how wrong I was. Few people identify as trans or non-binary, but no one perfectly fits the roles our communities assign us or the categories that define who and what we're supposed to be. God's assumption is right, because the sense of being different is part of being human. Whether or not we've had the experience of being treated as gerim, we all know, and whether or not we admit it, we all have the soul of the stranger. Thank you.
Thank you, Joy. As I fully expected, very deep, very thoughtful, and very moving. And I thank you for the vulnerability that you show in the process of teaching all of us a few new things. So thank you. I have a few points that you raised that I wanted to pursue with you and have a little conversation with you about. So let's start with childhood or young life anyway. And you spoke about growing up feeling invisible, afraid, and alone. But you also said that you didn't feel entirely alone because God and I had something in common. Neither of us could be seen or understood by those we dwelt among and loved. Your life has changed a lot since then. And so my question is, how well seen and understood do you feel now?
Wow, you went right for the jugular there, Aaron.
Oh, I've got a lot of good questions. and let me say, if it's too personal.
No, that is a great question. So when I started living as myself, which is the most accurate way that I can describe gender transition. So I started living the female gender identification that I'd always considered my true self. I believed that then I would be completely seen and understood. Because after all, I'm living as my true self. When I walk down the street, people are seeing the real me. In fact, at first, it felt like I'd turned myself inside out, literally. The deepest, darkest secret that I'd kept was I was now wearing as I walked down the street. And it took me a while to realize that when people I met who hadn't known me before, who didn't know that I was trans, when they just responded to me as a woman, because just by genetic accident, I pass pretty readily. It took me a while to realize that although I felt on one level like, oh, my childhood dream has come true, on another level, I felt like I wasn't being seen at all. because they were seeing my gender expression, awesome. They were seeing my gender identification, very important to me, but they were not seeing so many things about my life and myself that made me who I am. And I was very bitter when I realized that I had to choose between cutting myself down to fit this female gender presentation. In essence, saying to myself, actually, nothing about me matters except what fits my female gender identification, which is a terrible idea of humanity. I don't know anybody, trans or not trans, who would say, I'm nothing but my gender identification. You want to know what I am? Just look up the definition of man or woman in the dictionary, and that's me. That's it. Nothing more, nothing less. That would be monstrous. We all have to be more than that to be human. I had a choice between that, which I thought I'd always wanted, or recognizing that I would never fit binary gender. It would never really fully enable people to see me or recognize me. I don't think it works perfectly for anybody, but it was never going to work that well for me. And so I had to recognize that I was always going to be trans. And that meant recognizing that there were going to be large parts of me that even if people knew them, they were going to be hard to understand. And that, I think, is the personal thing that drove me to do this work about the mismatch, the slippage between identity defining roles and categories, the roles and categories we use to build relationships and communities and a sense of stability, and our humanity, which is always more than those. It's always too messy. As a religious person, I'd say we can never just fit those roles and categories because we're made in the image of a God who doesn't fit those roles and categories. The part of us that is rooted, that is most akin to God, is the part of us that doesn't fit human roles and categories. And so, in a certain way, I've seen embracing my difference, not as a way of being perfectly understood, I've just given that one up, but as a way of recognizing that, contrary to my feelings when I was growing up, I'm just like everybody else. That in my sense of difference, in my sense of being more than any roles or categories can ever make visible or comprehensible, that's something I have in common with everyone.
Beautiful answer. Thank you. I do have a couple of more questions, and we have a few more minutes. How has your sense of God's presence in your life changed over the years? Can you identify key turning points? And has there been any difference in how God felt to you before, during, and since your transition?
Well, when I was living as a man, my relationship to God kept evolving in certain ways. What I describe as the child relationship, and it is childish in a lot of different ways. There's an anthropomorphic over-identification with God, which helped me stay alive as a child. Oh yeah, God's just like me. This is not only flattering, but it made me feel less alone. Maimonides actually has a section in the Guide to the Perplexed where he says, don't let anybody think that they're at all like God, not even children. This is dangerous. So I shudder to think what would have happened if I'd had Maimonides as a therapist when I was a kid. So it was useful. As I grew up, I would say that that childish relationship to God became less and less satisfying to God in a certain kind of way. Because I was aware of not living the truth of myself, there were ways in which I did not develop ethically and morally because I didn't feel that I was really present. I didn't feel that the me who was behaving in the world was actually the real me. And so there was a sort of buffer with slack. And when it came to God, and this was an extremely bad habit, I felt like, well, no matter what I've done, God's done me worse, right? So, right, by putting me in this situation. So gender transition was a major inflection point in that. It was an agonizing process for me. It isn't for everybody, but it really was for me. And when I got to the other side of it, I mean, I knew I was only preserved through it by God's presence. And there were many like small interventions. I don't think this is unusual. I don't think I'm special, but I think this just happens. Um, but afterward, I woke up one day and I realized, I've been used to thinking that feeling like God owes me, like I'm entitled in the divine human relationship. God has privilege, divine privilege, and I've got, I'm the human oppressed person here. But now God actually answered my prayers. I am living the miracle of being reborn, of having the life that I was desperate to have. In fact, God not only answered my prayers in the present, God answered that tormented child. God exists outside of time. And so literally every version of me was answered at once. And I realized my relationship with God has to change. It has to change from one of resentment and entitlement to one of gratitude. And and I wanted to give something back. As somebody who was raised in a religious tradition, I think would just say I wanted to serve. Um, I did. I wanted to be worthy of what I was given. And I was aware that I profoundly was not worthy, which I think is a good place to be in a certain way. If you want to be intimate with God, I think that sense of unworthiness, that's maybe part of the intimacy. And then on the other side of it is, yeah, but loved.
Well, Joy, your writing and your speaking and simply the example of your life is certainly, from my point of view, giving a lot back to a lot of people. And you'll get a chance to look at the chat later and see that there are others saying that right now as we speak. I'm going to ask you one more question. I'm going to turn it over to the others. Do you always feel like you have the soul of a stranger, no matter who you're among? And will we, and by we, you can interpret that as trans Jews, however, will we always be Gerim, no matter where we reside or what we do? And then adding to that, because I'm presuming that which a little bit of what you're going to say, do you see that as a gift? And if so, how so?
So, yes to the first question about always feeling like a stranger, but a little bit differently than what I was describing at the end of my talk is the exalted or more the conscious version of being a ger. It's being a ger as a spiritual discipline. It's being a ger as part of the mitzvot. And there's a lot of stuff people do, and we can do it unconsciously or we can do it consciously. We can do it in relation to God or in relation to others or just so there are a lot of different ways to do it. The way that I'm answering your question now has to do with what I think is a developmental damage that came from growing up and spending so much of my life assuming that I really wasn't part of any of the communities that I supposedly belonged to. I never developed a sense of community, and I think it's a real sense. This is not true by any means of all trans or non-binary people. I think, some of the other abuse in my, anyway, my childhood was messed up in different ways, and this is what happened to me. I gave up on actually belonging anywhere. And so I never developed a sense of community, which is the sense of feeling yourself connected to this abstract thing. So like my wife, for example, she has an abundant sense of community, as Jews are supposed to have. Rainy after a long day of work, she's off to a shiva for a family she doesn't know. And I'm like, why are you going there? That's crazy. She's like, well, I'm a member of the community. This is a death in my community. And then I'm like, oh, right. Sense of community. Those who have it. It's kind of like color blindness. It's not that I'm against it. It's just that unless I'm confronted with it in a certain way, or like I imagine colorblind people develop tricks for crossing the street and things like that. So I develop tricks for, I look around and look at what people who have a sense of community are doing, and like, right, do what those kids, the cool kids are doing. They have a sense of belonging, so act like that. I have been in spaces where trans and non-binary people are us. And they're mostly temporary spaces, I would say. I've been in a couple of spiritual communities that have trans leadership. And I've only gone in and out, so I don't know what they would feel like on long term. But I have to say that the sense of difference there was much lower than it is in normal places. So, I think trans and non-binary people are like any other people. We can also build communities that put ourselves at the center and not at the margins. And when we do, we'll do it with the same limitations that other human communities do. We'll say, well, we're us. Us means X, Y, and Z. People who are not us, well, they're not us. They're not in the community, or they're at the margin, or they're right. So we'll do things like that, and we'll have roles and categories that we use to consolidate that sense of us. And I've been in those spaces, and it's kind of a break. But I also think that we can do better, that exactly like Moses and God want the Israelites to do better after they leave Egypt, right? You have just been slaves, people. You've just been made strangers in your own land. Moses names his kid, I've been a stranger in a strange land. If, can't we imprint on the Jewish soul, on the Jewish spiritual DNA, this experience of being a ger? And I would say trans and non-binary people, I think Jews didn't do particularly well with that, no better than other peoples, I would say. But I think trans and non-binary people, because most of the world will continue not to really work for us, because most of the world's going to continue to work on models of gender that either have no slot for us, or the only slot they have for us is other, which is better than no slot, but it's still not so much in terms of being understood or fitting in. So I think that we could be on the spiritual cutting edge in terms of that discipline and promoting that discipline. And in that sense, I do think it's a gift, because I think it enables me, not, unfortunately, it doesn't enable me to transcend my whiteness and all of the other crap that I internalized as an American. It doesn't enable me to do that, but it does give me a way and a pull beyond those things, and a way to connect with people who are too different for me to understand. And because I'm trans, I can say, oh, right, too different to understand. Been there, lived there. I can relate to that.
Thank you. I have someone who would like to ask you a question verbally. That would be Jessica Havens. If you would like to unmute.
Can I just, before we do that, can I just stop the recording now?
Yes. So to let everybody know, the next part will not be recorded.
How do I do that?
The revolution will not be televised.
Here's a